Right, so David Lammy, Labour's Foreign Secretary, has this week been sucking up to Trump-supporting Republicans, referring to himself as being a small c. Stop that tittering at the back there. That is small c conservative, in which case being the Labour representative of Tottenham for the last 20-odd years has been a sales pitch on false pretences. But he also made a rather startling admission regarding his view of Nelson Mandela, the former ANC South African President, saying that in his warped view, Mandela would have been against the Gaza protests. Not only has this triggered an excoriating response from Mandela's grandson, but the timing of Lammy's ridiculous comment couldn't have been worse for him personally, but also demonstrates how appallingly out of his depth Lammy is with regards to his brief, because he clearly hasn't the slightest notion about South Africa and Palestine relations, going back decades. If you thought voting Labour would vote a bunch of tin-eared idiots out, I'm afraid this latest Lammy lash-up implies you're just changing the idiots, and very little else. Right, so David Lammy is a Labour MP who can be relied upon to flip his opinions to suit his own personal aims at the drop of a hat. When Corbyn was leader, Lammy became a born-again socialist all of a sudden. Yet under Starmer has adopted the very same creeping sycophancy, changing his tune to suit his own careerist ends. It is frankly how he survived as a Labour MP for Tottenham for so long, but being a member of LFI and now using that same tactic of going native amongst whoever is in power around you, he's now done likewise with Donny's dunces stateside by labelling himself as a small c conservative and referred to Trump as being misunderstood. Even the BBC have called him out on this, reminding people that Lammy once upon a time referred to Trump as a neo-Nazi supporting sociopath. But then this is what David Lammy does. He is the leopard that is constantly changing his spots, the dictionary definition of a self-serving politician. But to egg on the right-wing throng he was addressing, he also chose to pass comment on the ongoing university campus protests happening in the US, and also other parts of the world, of course, notably here in the UK too, by bringing up Nelson Mandela. Perhaps Lammy thought he was being rather clever here, with South Africa having taken Israel to the International Court of Justice on the grounds of violating international humanitarian law, on the grounds of it committing genocide. In fact, South Africa have just submitted an urgent request for the indication and modification of previous provisional measures that the ICJ have handed down previously, to the ICJ again once more, in light of the changed circumstances, specifically relating now to Rafah, stating that the remaining existence of the Palestinian people of Gaza is now at stake. And with 1.6 million people trapped in Rafah, and with Israel having illegally taken control of the Rafah border crossing, now violating peace accords with Egypt as well, the escalation is plain to see. And I do hope the ICJ now act upon this request. But Lammy bringing up Mandela when he did, which was yesterday at time of writing, 10th of May, you might think this was bad timing, or therefore unlucky timing on Lammy's part, given South Africa writing to the ICJ, from his perspective of what he was trying to achieve here by kissing up to Trump supporters. But I'm coming on to that. But it is actually so much worse than just that. And if Lammy weren't so clueless regarding South Africa and Mandela himself, he might have known this was a bad idea. You see, the 10th of May this year marked the 30th anniversary since the inauguration of Nelson Mandela as the very first post-apartheid president of South Africa. And Lammy saying Mandela wouldn't have approved of these campus protests was just the icing on the cake of his own idiocy. Lammy said there is a difference between the peaceful protest Mandela would have advocated and the rioting and violence he claims was being observed on college campuses. The violence was coming from the police from where I'm looking, but this was also served to show Lammy had no idea who Mandela really was. But one guy who definitely does is the former ANC politician now resident here in the UK and has been selected to stand against Lammy's boss, Keir Starmer, in Holborn and St Pancras at the next general election, Andrew Feinstein. Feinstein was literally a member of Mandela's party, a part of that government at that time. So he sent a tweet addressing Lammy, saying, "I worked for Mandela, David Lammy. He would have supported the students as he did the Palestinian struggle his whole life. Don't besmirch the name of a liberator, a freedom fighter, who instigated civil disobedience and the armed struggle, a person of principle, i.e. everything you are not." Bingo! And yeah, Mandela wasn't all about peaceful protest either. Liberation sometimes has to come with a fight, and actually coming from someone like Andrew Feinstein, who has, since his time in South African politics, devoted his life to battling the global arms sales racket that so many nations disgustingly profit out of, this point made by him here carries even more weight. Mandela himself was criticised back in his day in a very famous interview for much of what we are seeing people being criticised here and now in relation to Israel, having met at the time with the likes of Gaddafi and Fidel Castro and the then Palestinian Liberation Organization leader Yasser Arafat, and criticised that he held these people up as human rights advocates simply because the US, where he was being interviewed there, and he came back with a 19-word statement that completely destroyed the basis for that argument presented to him by a US spokesperson. And he said, "One of the mistakes which some political analysts make is to think that their enemies should be our enemies." And that is exactly what Israel is demanding now, isn't it? Whilst also demanding we cast a blind eye to the genocide they are carrying out. That is exactly what ardent allies of the Israel project are demanding too, just like the US. The US then, just as it is now, amongst others. Mandela is also credited as having said, "We know too well that our freedom is incomplete without the freedom of the Palestinians." South Africa knew apartheid when they saw it in Palestine and Israel then, just as they still do now. And no other country on earth, frankly, in my view, is a better authority on that subject. The world should be following their lead, not the lead of others, and certainly not those David Lammy is associating himself with now in the US, a man clearly with no idea about what he is talking about. He is either being dishonest or he really is just that much of a fool to believe this. Either way, you wouldn't want that in a politician, would you, surely? Indeed, another Mandela has waded into this argument as well, giving what I would argue is the biggest beasting of Lammy of them all, in a statement from Nelson Mandela's grandson, the currently serving ANC politician Zwelivelile Mandela. "We call on students all over the world to emulate the student protest encampments on USA university campuses. Friday 10th of May 2024, today marks 30 years since the inauguration of President Nelson Mandela on the 10th of May 1994. I dedicate the memory of this day to the students protesting on USA university campuses, calling for an immediate ceasefire of the genocide of Gaza and supporting the struggle of the Palestinian people for freedom. We recall Madiba's historic words on this day when he said, 'We dedicate this day to all the heroes and heroines in this country and the rest of the world who sacrificed in many ways and surrendered their lives so that we could be free.' Contrary to what David Lammy, the Labour MP in the UK, would like us to believe, Madiba acknowledged the heroes in the civil rights movement in the USA and campuses all over the world who regularly protested for our freedom. He himself was of that generation of South African youth who called for the armed struggle in the face of increasing state brutality in dealing with peaceful protest against apartheid. The youth on USA campuses are emulating and following in the brave footsteps of the youth of 1968, who came out openly protesting against the war in Vietnam. On countless occasions acknowledged the role of the student protests of 1976 Soweto uprising for playing a seminal role in our march to freedom. From his prison cell, he echoed the calls to the students of the 1980s to make South Africa ungovernable. David Lammy mustn't be an apologist for apartheid Israel and for the ongoing genocide in Gaza. He must echo President Nelson Mandela's commitment to the Palestinian struggle, which he affirmed during his visit to Gaza in 1995 when he said, "Our freedom is incomplete without the freedom of the Palestinian people." We call on David Lammy to stop being an apologist for genocide and instead encourage all students on UK and European university campuses to emulate their fellow students in the USA in their call for a ceasefire in Gaza and support the struggle of the Palestinian people for freedom. Youth are the conscience of our world, and their voices are the moral compass that guide us to a better future. Rather than brutalise them and criminalise their protest actions, we must encourage them to continue to stand for justice, human rights, and dignity for all humanity. You are our heroes. We salute you. An apologist for genocide. That is damning, and coming from a Mandela, infinitely more so than coming from pretty much anyone else on the planet, certainly outside of Palestine right now, at any rate. David Lammy is completely wrong, as most mainstream media and politicians here in the UK are as well. If Lammy had any integrity, he would apologise for his words, but he doesn't, so I don't expect he will. He will no doubt just change his spots again in future in whatever direction suits him best. Keir Starmer has taught him well in that regard, I suppose. Big up the student protests, solidarity to all of those involved, and free Palestine. Meanwhile, Keir Starmer is determined to win our votes back, apparently after getting another underwhelming set of results in the local elections. Despite how bad the Tories are, he just doesn't seem to get that people are more and more looking for change now, and he isn't it, becoming ever less so. But of course there very much is other options, as this video recommendation will tell you all about. I'll hope to catch you on the next vid. Cheers folks.